بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى واغفر لنا ذنوبنا ولا غافر للذنوب إلا أنت. ونصلي ونسلم على خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين الذي أرسلته ليبين لنا الدين. أما بعد, we wanted to focus on an important point with regard to the issue of how we deal with each other as an ummah. Anyone who is a conscious reader of the situation or situations that the Muslim community finds itself in overall, and society overall. But this issue doesn't only apply to Muslims, it applies to non-Muslims as well, people in general. And one of the commitments that I made prior to the new calendar year, and I say in brackets calendar year, because I know that we have our own calendars. One of the commitments I made was to open up my discourse to try to imitate the Quranic discourse a little better. And that is to address myself to more than just the Muslim community. Right? And to try to be of a service to more than just the Muslim community in my dialogues and so on and so forth. All that aside, anyone who is understanding what's going on in the world today comes to a realization that many communities are in detrimental situations, some even genocidal situations, some in situations of destruction by attrition, and some in situations of open war, some in situations of disease, some in situations of poverty. And there's a combination of all of that, some in situations of natural disaster. So in a time like that, a time in which people are suffering circumstances and life situations which are problematic and affect their very existence, there's a set of priorities that comes of how we are to navigate in that situation. There is kind of a big picture view, but then when you look internally as well, you start to focus the lens, so to speak, and you start to look at communities as individual groups. You move away from the bigger picture of what's going on in countries and so on and so forth and geographical regions, and then you come into communities. And when you look at certain communities, you're going to assess what are strengths and weaknesses in those communities if you're approaching the issue from a scholarly angle, from a sociological angle, from the angle of weighing what is the situation and status of various communities. And that can go into other realms. That can go into other realms, the realm of economics, politics, culture, everything that comes along with that when you start studying communities, but as a group. And then you can study the individuals of that group, like where are they at, and what are the strengths and weaknesses that are there. I say all of that to say that a lot of times the stuff that we're engaged in, and this is not a judgmental statement, so to speak, to the point that it is to accuse people. It's judgmental from the angle of Could we use our time and resources better? Could we apply ourselves in different ways to achieve betterment? And what I mean by betterment is to better our situation as human beings. That becomes a very critical question, especially if we're talking about the survival of human beings on this planet in the bigger picture, or the survival of specific communities. I say that to say that, when you look at social media, and social media in and of itself is not a problem, but social media is reflecting to a large extent. Some people like to say, well, life is not social media. Well, I have a little bit of a doubt of thinking that everything on social media is fake, just because of the interaction with life itself and with people and what their situations and circumstances are. In the everyday, when you interact with people face to face, sometimes it's not all that different than what you see, and sometimes it is. I'm not going to say it's 100% true, 100% false. But I say that to say that just to give you a way to see what's going on in the world. The social media is a good tool that reflects where there's different trends. It gives you at your fingertips a way to kind of analyze, and then you can do deeper, more systematic research in other ways. But there's a lot of people that go back and forth in very destructive patterns, right? And that includes all communities without even exception of religion. There's a lot of destructive patterns of communication and interaction that are visible, even to the point where it has reached a level in certain circles, like youth and others, where violence, has come about, just because of the types of interactions that people have. And then you find that how that interaction is recorded on social media for people to see. You know what I'm saying? And so that's how we have become like that. Before there was a lot of jokes, and then it turned into disparaging remarks about those who use texting language, how they have created their own language in communication, and how, there's deficiencies in that, and how they can't write, and how they, so there becomes gaps that are even between people, how they look at each other, how they value each other. They don't see the value of people just trying to communicate, even if it's, in the texting form, as an example. They look at the negatives of it to the point where it's just almost like, you start to wonder, how much are we looking at each other as human beings that have value, or how much are we judging each other in a way which is detrimental to our interaction or to our interaction. And so the situation, that right now I want to focus on is the issue of religious sectarianism. For a while, there was a level of hot interactions and even almost like a religious cold war. And at times it got problematic, between, communities, between different groups. Say, you found some of the approach of brothers from the Salafi Dawah at one point was extremely harsh, when it came to dealing with the Sufis and others. And I'm going to tell you, people, this is extremely hard for me to talk about these types of issues, because it puts us as a community in a corner. And the corner that it puts to us as a community is that we're supposed to be sharing. We're supposed to be sharing the goodness of what Islam brings to us, to with other people. That's the bottom line. Part of our commitment in our pledge, because when we take the shahada, when we bear testimony, is a pledge that we're making. And we may not necessarily always live up to that pledge, but part of the testimony that we make and the pledge that we make is we're committing to the deen. And then part of that commitment is to share with the world what the goodness of Islam is, or what the goodness that we can bring is. That's something that's extremely important. And so when we don't know how to interact with each other properly, Walaikum salam. Okay, when we interact with each other in the negative way, what we are performing for humanity is we're basically telling humanity that deen is not efficacious. And I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to go into a lot of explanation what that means. Some of you clearly understand what I'm saying by that. But for the sake of removing ourselves from embarrassment and remember that the world is watching. World is watching. Like I said, one of my commitments on a personal level for this new, after this decade and this century from the calendar year. And I know that we have our own calendar as Muslims, but it's a calendar year. It's a bracketing of time. It's to open up my discourse to be more imitative of the Quran and be able to address different communities. And Malcolm, this is one of the things that has reshaped my thinking about Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, rahmatullahi alayhi, and the profundity of teaching. And I'm of the opinion that Allah allowed Malcolm to have hand in reviving the deen, and we still have not understood that. One of the things that you find in him creating multiple organizations, one for interacting with non-Muslims in unison, and one for dealing with the Muslims. Some people, and initially I went through a phase in my life where I thought it was nationalism, I thought it was problematic, this, that. But in reality, it is very imitative of the Quranic technique. Like, we have to have a common ground between those who differ with us, but we have a relationship with them. And then those who we say that we have a common ground and a pledge to a plethora of things. The people from your own jama'ah of belief, that you're claiming, like, we're not going to argue about these various things because we believe in them and we have a commitment to them. And what we have before us is action. So that's very important to understand that, Malcolm had opened up that trajectory. We didn't follow it. And some of the ideas that came in and how we understand Islam is that we write people off that don't think like us. That's problematic, especially when it comes to people that are not from the same religious orientation. It became an issue of animosity, and it became an issue of you in your corner and us in our corner, when that's not imitative of the prophetic example. Remember that we said that the prophetic example, part of that commitment to it is sharing the good that Islam has to bring. So we have to be more conscious of how it is that we're interacting with each other and how it is that we're presenting Islam to the world, because at this point it is extremely embarrassing. And part of that issue is not an issue just of image. Part of that issue comes from the reality of how we interact with the dynamics of oppression, right? That's part of the reality. Assalamu alaikum. So that's the issue that we confront, that how are we going to interact? I made the point of saying outside of ourselves. The second thing is, like, what has happened with some of the trajectories. We saw this phase where some of the brothers who claimed to be Sufis, they were burnt out from what they experienced from some of the Salafi brothers in the past. And then that kind of calmed down, and then now people are enforcing the Aqidah issue in the same way that some of the Salafis have enforced the Aqidah issue, and is almost presented from a takfir perspective. People, this is why I started off this reflection with saying that, how we analyze things. People, the Muslim community is suffering, yo. The Muslim community is suffering. The world community is suffering. That type of approach to be taken when it comes to interacting with each other, the dehumanizing approach, that's not from the deen. Whether it's done by the Ashari, or whether it's done by the Sufi, or whether it's done by the Sunni, or whether it's done by the Salafi, however you want to say, however you want to orient yourself in that regard, what's between us and the people and each other is not names. What's between us and the people, what's between us as a group, between each other, It's not names. It's the book and the sunnah. That's the reality. Our commitment to something very fundamental and very simple, which is that shahada. After that, everything else is predicated upon evidence and research and, orientation and all that. That's the only thing that's between us. What's between us is, I don't care if you call yourself Sufi, Salafi, this, that. I want to see where you stand within the range of the book and the sunnah. That's the reality at the end of the day. You can sit there and until you're blue in the face and try to explain to me, what it is that all of those things mean. But if it's not, because I have a commitment, and I may not always perfectly follow it out, I have a commitment to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions and those who build up their reflections on the deen in that regard, which that makes me different than a Shii in that regard. You know what I'm saying? And if I have a commitment to that, and in specific, I have a commitment to orient myself in a particular way, then you take me to account in that orientation that, well, you say you follow this system, you say this, that. In a dialogue that's healthy, right? In a dialogue that's healthy. We have not learned that. We have not learned that issue. There's al-muttafiq fihi wa mukhtalif alayh. There's things that are agreed upon, and there's things that are different over, and there's things that majmu'un alayh, that are consensus. There's no debate about it. And some people, they like to say we follow the book and the sunnah and consensus and this and that. But in reality, that's not, it's not being followed. And it's not just following the book and the sunnah and consensus. It's following the book and the sunnah and consensus and knowing how to deal with differences of opinion based on evidence. And so I say that because we're, some of us must be out of our minds, from the angle of, you don't see that the Muslim world, the largest refugee population on the face of the earth is the Muslim community. You don't see that countries are collapsing. You don't see that poverty is overtaking people. Real life situations at the core. We have in the maqasid of the Sharia, one of the essentials, and the scholars, actually, there's an internal debate amongst the ulama with regard to the objectives of the Sharia and the whole issue of priority. What gets priority? Does deen come first? Preservation of deen come first? Or does preservation of life come first? And of course, if there's no life, there's no deen for people. If there's no human being that exists, there's not going to be any practice. So that's why I said there's some of the ulama, they put to question the whole issue of, does it have to be, when we start talking about what does the Sharia aim at with regard to preservation and orienting us? Is it preserving Islam first, and then life, then intellect, then family, then wealth, then dignity? Even the issue of dignity becomes problematic. Some of the scholars, they debated about that point. But, the Quran itself gives too much evidence to just say that the preservation of dignity is not part of the priorities of the deen. But if you can't put dignity all the way at the end. So the point that I'm saying is, if there's no human life with dignity and there's no intellect, how is there going to be a practice of the deen? There's some logic here in this regard. The first thing that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala reveals to the human being is knowledge of self. Who are you? Where do you come from? What is your origin? What is your relationship to yourself, to the universe, to the unseen? Admit who it is that is the one that is all powerful over this. And that teaching manifested itself as Allah is our Rabb. But that's the first thing. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala didn't go into a lot of details on issues. That's the first revelation that we get. The first revelation that we get is, who are we as human beings? And understand that process. You're not a dog. You're not a cat. You're not a tree. You're not a robot. You're not a jinn. Who are you? And that whole process, and to be in the sense of awareness over that issue. So I say all of that to say that, look, man, without human life being preserved, there's going to be no practice of the deen. You can't have the practice of the deen in the sense that the Rasul brought it to us, because there's two. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahmatullahi alayhi, he makes us aware that there's two orders at work, and they complement each other. Even opposite to Ibn Taymiyyah, Dr. Taha Jabir, he even talked about there's two readings, so to speak. Ibn Taymiyyah takes it from the angle of what? That there's the yani al-irada al-kawniyya wa al-irada al-diniyya. Right? And so that comes back to the issue that there's the creation. There's the will of Allah that manifests itself in the creation. We have no say in that whatsoever, except what Allah wills for us as the khulafa in the dunya, as the khalifa of the dunya. Whatever Allah allows us to bend and rules and this and that, it's still not going to go out of the qadr of Allah. Right? Human beings are different than anything else in that regard. So that's one level, that in that state of Islam, all human beings share in that. In the biological state, in the creation state, all human beings share in that. Where human beings don't share at is in the angle of what? In the angle of following the revelation. Of following the revelation. So, when we start talking about people following the revelation, the Prophet ﷺ didn't come with the sword to force people into the deen. People have to be persuaded and be convinced with proofs, right? With evidence, so to speak. They have to be cognizant of what it is that they are practicing. They have to understand. That's why one of the points of having obligation in the deen, when we start talking about taklif, being responsible for your deeds in the deen, one of the things is to have a sound intellect, to be able to understand what it is that you're following. And so I say all that to say that, look, without that biological existence of the human being, the other side of revelation, where is it going to go? Who's going to practice that? And so in order for us to have a sound understanding of the deen, we have to understand the universe, and we have to understand the creation. There's the book of creation and there's the book of revelation. It's not just an issue of just basic ibadah and not understanding our role in the universe and so on and so forth. The Quran tells us about the universe. The first revelation tells us about the universe, our place in it, and this and that. So there's a balance between these realities. So we have to respect the fact that there is no forcing other people to come into the deen. That brings us to the issue of how do we coexist. That coexistence has to be predicated on justice and equity. Right? That's why whether it's Muslim or not Muslim, the Muslim is obligated to deal with human beings on the principle of justice. Right? On the principle of justice, no matter who they may be. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayhi, he even indicated that the political order that has religious belief but has injustice, it won't maintain itself. But the political order which has justice, even if it has unbelief, can maintain itself. And that's an indication that when it comes to our existence in the world, justice is key in that. No matter who we're dealing with, justice is key in that. If you look at one of the four models of existence that is laid out in Sirah, in the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first stage of existence, right? And so our dealing with each other, it has to take into consideration our existence as a community. Muslims can't afford to internally be debating with each other about who Allah is in a non-scholarly way. I quote me on that point in quotations, in a non-scholarly way. In an environment in which the existence of the community is under threat. That in itself violates the points of the deen. What is the priority of religious discourse if the religious discourse can't even see that human beings are suffering and that the suffering is at a level of which those human beings may not exist? At that point in time, the priority of the moment is to address the human struggle of people and their existence versus getting into details of religiosity and so on and so forth, because the core of the deen is not different over. The core of the deen we all hold in common. What we are debating on in these issues, a lot of times is tafriyat that are important, but they're not from the usul, so to speak. They're not always from the usul, because in the usul, nobody's going to come in and differ on that issue. That's the reality over that point. The deen is not such that we come in and we differ over the usul. That's not how it works. There's some points that open up to understanding. And then that's the issue that we have to deal with. Those issues that we have to clarify. How do we understand those things? And so the problematic that we find here is that the lack of priority of how do we teach and how do we build the community, how we interact with the world. And I say that to say what, this live actually was inspired by, I'm in a particular circle, and mostly the circle is students that have studied around a particular Shaikh. And so he's one of the Mashaykh from Al-Azhar al-Sharif. And so one of the guys comes in and he brings on a lecture, a talk by a brother who claims he's Ashari. And he comes in and every other word is kufr. Every other word is the mujassima, this is kufr, this, that. So I'm like, what's the difference between that and the Salafi brother who was from a particular group who came in and everybody else that differs with them, this is off the minhaj, this is this. Or what's the difference between that and, the one who has political qualms? So everything is, the system is a kufr system. What's the difference between that and the Sufi Shaykh who claims he's at a high level of understanding and everyone's iman is void except his iman? And so in order for you to really have iman, you have to follow what it is that he says. What's the difference between that and the Shi'i who comes and makes takfir of everyone else because they say, that they love the Sahaba? Or what's the difference between that and the Batiniyya from the extreme Ismailiyya? All of them are on the same minhaj. All of them are on the same minhaj of takfir. On the same minhaj of just, it's so easy to call a person a kafir. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And I'm going to say in his broadest terms, because Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah said he also included a space, even though he differed with the Asharis, he considered a space for them, that they are Ahl Sunnah when the people of Hadith are not there, because he was inclined towards the people of Hadith. But he still acknowledged their role, right? And there's that sense of, Imam Shawkani also had a certain way of dealing with that situation. Not all of the ulama deal with this, and I'm aware of it like that. I'm aware of, Shaykh Uthaymeen emphasizing this point of the differences between the Asharis and the others, but not to the level that we see with other people. Not to the level that we see with other people. There was a clarification. It was done in a scholarly way, and that's it. We don't follow this, we don't follow that type of approach. Shaykh Hassan al-Shafi, who's one of the biggest scholars in Aqidah and Al-Azhar al-Sharif, and a scholar of Ilm al-Kalam, Ashari, Maturidi, and he was one of my teachers. And his dealing with the Salafi da'wah, one of the things that he had praised was the ulama of Yemen, especially Amir Sana'ani, Shaykh al-Maqbali, Imam Ibn Wazir, Imam Shawkani, all of them. Why? Because of the way that they dealt with those who they disagreed with in Ilm al-Kalam. So there's a certain scholarly way of navigating this stuff. But it's very sad to see that now some of the Ashari brothers are repeating the same cycle where we saw some of this decline a little bit, and people want to they understand that there's differences. They understand that there's differences, people in general. And people want to see this type of sectarian approach decline. We can deal with it on a knowledge basis. And then at the end, it may be an issue that, you may differ, we may differ, we may have to leave it at that. But this type of approach where we take away from the impact of deen on the world so that we sit and we debate with each other and we argue with each other. I'm going to end on this note, people. That's what collapsed Al-Andalus. And that's why Al-Andalus does not exist on the face of the earth now. And I'm going to tell you, people, look at the Muslim Ummah in today's time, people. Look at where the Muslims are at. Look at the biological decline of the Muslim community due to war, due to sectarianism. Look at the threats that are there. What is our impact on the world, people? We ourselves begin to collapse. We ourselves begin not to want to go to the masjid. We ourselves want not to begin to deal with Muslims because of the level of dissension and chaos and understanding and opinions. This type of stuff, it has nothing to do with knowledge at this point. It seems more like it's anger and desire that are coming to the fore and clouding people's minds and making them like enemies. And that has a smell and a scent of shaitan in our midst, having a massive impact on people to the point where they can't even come to the core of issues and deal with issues in a proper way and even agree to disagree. But istabiqu fil khairat is the command of the Quran. Compete with one another and bringing about good deeds. This is one of the reasons why it is that the ulama in the past had a detest for ilm al-kalam. And it's not, I'm not saying this to go against this group or that group. I'm talking about the wisdom of the scholars of the past, because there's some things that come into the realm of dhanniyat. As much as you want to say that they're from the qatiyat, there's some things that are just plausible to be understood in multiple ways. And if you keep going into that and arguing about it and debating about it and this and that, you're just going to end up in conflict if you don't know how to handle solid interaction and communication and exchange. If it's an issue of one man upmanship, that one person yurid an yaghlib ala al-akhari, wants to overpower and dominate over the other person, then that situation is never going to amount to any sort of reconciliation or brotherhood or common ground or anything, because it ceased to be an issue of knowledge and it becomes a disease of the heart. And the fact that you are reaching a point that you want to argue to such an extent that you will violate the dignity of another human being and you will even cut that person off. The whole idea of cutting people off in the deen was to bring them into the community, is an iqab, yani lil ukhuwa. That's the reality, is that the issue of hijrah or migrating away from people or isolating them, that was to bring them back into the community. It wasn't to punish them, to exile them, and to cast them into the hellfire. That type of approach is not Islamic. That's some other type of stuff that has been injected into the deen. But the Prophet Muhammad was sent rahmatan lil alameen. And I end on that note. People, we need to wake up. The situation of the ummah is dire. Is dire. And so it's like when you start seeing this, this type of back and forth, it just continues from one group to the next. It's insane. And in the midst, people are doing that, and their countries are being wrecked. Their families are being wrecked. Their masajid are being wrecked. Deen is a refuge. And let's leave it like that. Let's leave the deen as a refuge for people to find some sort of solace and comfort and peace. Don't make the deen a fitna. If you want to debate certain points, do it in a way that's scholarly and put it in a scholarly circle. It's not a back and forth issue that we share with each other in passing. And the scholars never dealt with issues like that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.